You know, a game before being released goes through multiple iterations of itself until settling on a finished version, being relatively incomplete in any date before completion or completely different. The same is the case with Sonic games, and today we'll be taking a look at Sonic Unleashed's betas, prototypes, trailers and concept art. This video is a follow-up to my Unleashed cut content video, and the second part of a 3-part video, which is also part of a remake project I'm making of these 5 videos. You can watch them by any order you want, but I recommend watching all of them to get a full picture of this game's development. As such, most of the cut content left over in this build that is also present in the final won't really be covered to avoid repetition, so yeah. As I did before, I want to thank Archie and Starlight, who have helped me tremendously with compiling a lot of info not documented online, so make sure to check them out. I also want to thank all modders and researchers and data miners and everyone that has made this possible. So let's take a look at them. Sonic Unleashed is a rather rich game when it comes to development documentation. There are a total of 5 early builds accessible online, 2 of them only by footage and the other 3 actually being downloadable. There are also some really early trailers of the game showing very bare bones iterations of it, as well as some pretty interesting concept art considering the new art direction the game took compared to other games. So let's start by covering the betas and prototypes, starting by the E3 build. Unleashed, much like any other Sonic game, was present at numerous events to showcase it to fans and press alike, including E3 2008. As is tradition as well, these builds feature a lot of noticeable differences when compared to the final product. The stages showcased in here are Windmill Isle Act 2 Day, Dragon Road Act 1 Day, Rooftop Run Act 1 Day and Windmill Isle Act 1 Night. Sadly, this build has not been leaked, thus all we have is somewhat low quality footage of it. The most noticeable difference at first is the HUD, both for Sonic and the Werehog. Starting by Sonic, the life icon has a different drop shadow and the life counter has a different stroke effect. The font used for the text and numbers is completely different. The backgrounds for the time and score meter have different opacities, color and size compared to the final. The ring counter says ring instead of rings. And the boost gauge seems to have a sort of blur effect at the end, which looks pretty clean honestly. As for the Werehog, the first thing you'll notice is that the HUD is completely different from the final version. There is no life or ring counter as well as no score meter. The Unleash and life gauges are replaced with shield and vitality meters. Vitality is the equivalent to life, so not much there, but shield suggests that you couldn't hold the shield forever. And the combo graphic has the number of hits and the hits text on the upper part, instead of just a number. The text is also changed to hit instead of hits in the final. As for graphical differences, the title screen looks completely different from the final, having a different font for the press start button text and a background where you can see galaxies and shooting stars. The main menu also looks nothing like the final. I don't even have to explain what looks different, do I? Also, the stages here are referred to in the same way as they are internally, with the Poros being Mykonos, Pagonia EU and Chun-nan China. The game at this point still used the high-quality global illumination maps, at a point in development when the game was still meant to use 2 discs. Besides looking better, you can also tell that the game is much laggier than the final version. The rail booster has a slightly different design, as does the rainbow ring, as also does the accelerator gun, having a red outline instead of a green one. The jump wall used for Sonic looks completely different from the final. Sonic's model is also different, being a much earlier iteration. The marker used for targeting objects with a homing attack looks more like a crosshair in the demo. The pause menu looks really bare bones, though it's basically just using a different font and missing drop shadows. The lighting on Sonic looks noticeably different, as it looks like he has a sort of white halo around him. I don't know how to explain it, but it just looks weird. The blur effect on him when he uses the boost is also much stronger, also missing the shockwave effect when using it. The boost also has a camera shake effect. When you pick up rings, they do not travel to the ring icon on the HUD. Speaking of rings, they have a weird glow effect in the night stages. The 1-up is an item box here, despite the fact that no item boxes are present in the game. Interestingly, the unused shield capsule from Sonic 06 also appears here, reusing its model and texture yet also being removed from this game. The keystones have a more transparent look, dark, making their color less evident. As for layout differences, even though a lot of stuff is different, not many of it is very interesting or surprising. A lot of NPCs are missing from stages, such as the pelican and the humans on this bridge in Windmill Isle. Most, if not all medals are completely absent from the game. A lot of camera angles are different, looking very incomplete or being missing completely. Enemy placement is also sometimes different or just really weird, such as having spinner badniks in this section of Windmill Isle instead of the normal egg fighters, or there are enemies missing in some areas compared to the final as well. The green boxes are missing here in Dragon Road, there are rings missing in this loop. Speaking of loops, the splines don't seem to be 100% finished, causing Sonic to fall in some areas, as well as some springs having collision issues. The steps in this platform don't extend all the way to the bottom. In the Werehog stages, there don't seem to be any dark Gaia walls, or whatever this is called, preventing you from going to the next section without defeating the enemies guarding it. Some of the dark Gaia minions have different color variations in the wrong areas, such as right at the start, being blue instead of green. This platform moves side to side instead of up and down like the final, and ring positioning is also sometimes different. As for audio differences, Sonic would always shout when using the boost. The dying sound for some enemies is different. Every song shown in this demo sounds very early and different compared to the final version, with some also being found in trailers or in the preview build we'll be covering in just a moment, so take a listen. And that's about it for the E3 demo. Now let's take a look at the TGS build. From what was shown at this event, everything appears to be either identical to the final or to the preview build, which I'll dive more into in just a moment, but the surface level differences are a different jump wall effect and a boost shockwave. The render distance also appears to be considerably lower in this build. Even with this, here are the loading screens from this build used for the SD version. And that's about everything for the TGS build, considering there's not much footage of it. Now let's take a look at the fabled preview build. The Xbox 360 preview build of Sonic Unleashed is a debug build from in between the E3 demo and the final build. Unfortunately, only the first disc of this build has been found and dumped, and the second is most likely lost, but even the disc that we have has a wealth of differences compared to the final. It was built on the 31st of August of 2008 and was found and dumped by obscure gamers on the 6th of December 2016. Firstly, the title screen looks basically the same. The biggest difference here is that the press start button was changed to press start, and the game waits until you do press start to show the correct planet. This build features two different main menus, a very in-progress version of the final one and the early version used at E3. Starting by the in-progress one, the icon used for Tails is different from the one used in the final, with the dialogue also being slightly changed. Some textures have a slightly different tone of color, namely the grass. Every area has a disc symbol accompanied by a number. This is a remnant of the game using two discs at a time, probably meant to signal to the developers in which disc every stage is present. There are also some alternate icons for these discs left over in the files. The cursor looks very bare bones, missing the TV scanline effect and the gradient applied to the colors, just changing from entirely green to entirely yellow. The icons used for the sun and moon medals are different, as well as missing the level text next to them. The number of medals is hugely incorrect too, displaying more than 1,000 medals all throughout the game. The sun and moon icons placed next to the flags are also different. The early version has an icon with Tails' tails, while the final is missing them. The world map text is more spaced out in the early version and has a different positioning. It's also missing any sort of stroke effect or drop shadow. The country's description text is in black instead of white, as well as having a bigger line spacing, making some descriptions unreadable. The font used for the country names is different, with the photos being misspelled with two P's. Instead of featuring a screenshot of the area, the preview build uses a placeholder image saying the internal name for the stage as well as the time of day, with Spagonia being European Union for example. The stages that don't have these placeholders either have different images from the final or screenshots of the Sonic Unleashed beta. I'm not even kidding. Adabat Night has a screenshot of a very early version of the hub worlds, with the UI being really different, using the early stage HUD, Sonic using a different model and the area using very bare bones and incomplete lighting, along with some debug text on screen. Speaking of placeholders, a lot of stage entries in the hub world aren't really identified how they should be. For example, Adabat's main stage is literally called Ah, and missions are placeholdered like collect X bananas for example, just random goofy stuff. And lastly, the X button says wait instead of past time, with the text being capitalized and having a different positioning. The UI graphic for the world map actually features a battle option, which never appears in this build and was completely removed in the final. Curiously, Tails asks you to go to Mazuri in the day, yet when you do enter it, it will be nighttime. As for the E3 menu, this can only be accessed by using the install option in the title screen, which opens the debug menu I'll be covering in a bit. This menu looks nothing like the final one, I don't even have to explain what's different, it's literally the same as the E3 build. There is still some stuff that is pretty interesting, namely Rooftop Run being called Orange Roofs, which is the Japanese name for the stage. Selecting any stage here works as normal. This being an early build, there are a ton of gameplay and graphical differences compared to the final. Here are probably all of them. Firstly, the pause menu looks pretty unfinished. This build uses a werehog icon instead of Sonic's icon. The frame rate is still uncapped at this point, considering this is an Xbox 360 build whose final version was capped to 30 FPS. While Sonic's HUD is mostly finalized, the werehog still uses the E3 HUD, having the vitality and shield meters I mentioned in the E3 build. Even with this, Sonic still has a different jump wall effect and camera shake when using the boost. The color used for some of the werehog's effects is also different, being mostly a greyish blue instead of a dark and light purple. The Chaos Orbs are also dark grey instead of yellow, as well as his fur effect appearing to be missing, or most effects related to his attacks really. Speaking of E3, Sonic's homing reticle is still the same as the one from that event. Loading some stages displays the control tutorial images that go unused in the final. The arrow icons that appear above Dark Gaia minions are different, and their cries also sound build quite different. The little Rexes are purple in this build instead of green. The animation used for homing attacking a balloon is different and repeatedly plays the dash ring sound effect for some reason. The global illumination in this build is noticeably higher quality than the one the final uses, hence why the game was meant to use 2 discs as they couldn't fit in just one. In the end, this idea was dropped in favor of accessibility, so the GI maps were further compressed. Most of the NPC dialogue is still unimplemented at this time, resulting in some pretty amusing text entries. On the same note, the credit sequence is either really broken or just full of some random placeholder text, as you can't make any sense of what's written in it. Some NPCs are also completely frozen for some reason. The entrance stages have a timer, which is absent in the final. There is a retry option present in the results screen, which was completely removed from the final, making a return in Sonic Generations. Even so, it doesn't really work here, it just warps Sonic back to his spawn point, with the music stopping, the HUD disappearing, and making the camera stop working correctly. Interestingly, you can actually get 1000 lives and rings in this build, instead of 99 and 999 respectively. The hub world gates are missing their sun and moon graphic. The physics are still unrefined at this point, resulting in some pretty weird behavior, like when you lose rings mid-air. Sonic's controls are also pretty slippery with less air drag, which isn't helped at all by the fact that the drift doesn't work for some weird fucking reason, and the Werehog is noticeably slower as well as being more clunky, having some input delay for moving after using an attack, making his gameplay even more unpleasant. Sonic himself is also even slower in the hub worlds than normal. The hub world transformation scenes look really early compared to the final ones. They are obviously just placeholders, as the lighting, animations and effects are all very basic. The effect for the Werehog's fur shader is also completely missing. These scenes are pretty much identical to the final in terms of animation, except for this little hop Sonic does after going back to normal, which was omitted. The pre-rendered scene used for the title screen loop is also pretty different. The final version has a teaser animation before the trailer portion, which is missing in the preview build. The Sega splash screen is still the same as in Sonic 06, with the thicker presented by text. The preview build's video appears to be identical to the E3 trailer I'll be analyzing further in the video. There are a bunch of differences between the E3 build and preview, which are pretty much the same ones as between that one and the final. Lastly, the Werehog has a bunch of placeholder and unused skills and combos. Most of them are just really bare bones and were completely removed from the final game, while others are really just placeholders and don't even exist in the build. Looking at the input for some of them, it's no wonder why they were scrapped. Even so, there are actually leftover animations for some of these, including upwards attacks, a ground smash and some sort of jumping animation. As for audio differences, pressing start on the title screen reuses the same sound effect from Sonic 06. Since there's no speed meter after running through a checkpoint, the sound effect for it is missing. The sound effect used for collecting a super ring is the same as a normal ring. Sonic is missing any lines for the results screen ranks. The Werehog has practically no voice clips, and the ones that he does have appear to be from the Japanese dub. A lot of sound effects are just placeholders and really generic, such as the stomp ice in Cool Edge making a glass break sound instead of having its own sounds. Also, a lot of sound effects are just completely missing, such as the whale scream in Cool Edge. And there is a leftover early version of Savannah Citadel Night in the game files. Take a listen. There are also a bunch of level layout differences between this build and the final. Starting by Windmill Isle, the hub world itself is identical to the final one except for the number of NPCs walking around, which are a lot. Some of them are duplicates and can even be found next to each other, which is quite strange. Act 1 is missing the spikes in the final section and the red egg fighters are the normal variant here. Act 2 is basically the same as the final, however it seems to use the E3 layout's enemy positioning. Act 3 does feature a pretty bare bones layout, although missing a gold ring. The camera is also pretty much unfunctional and switches from 2D to 3D and vice versa seemingly at random. Act 4 has no terrain and really only has Act 3's object layouts. The Night Act 1 is very similar to the one shown at E3, having the Dark Heel enemy which only appears in Arid Sands Night in the final. There's not much that's interesting about this layout besides that, it's just early and different. And Act 2 Night just crashes. As for Savannah Citadel, the hub world is mostly identical to the final, although it features some butterflies which were ultimately removed. Act 1 is really interesting. The first thing you'll notice in this stage is that some objects have really noticeable vertex explosions, hence why there are seemingly random lines and textures floating around the stage. Secondly, in the first running section, which is supposed to be completely empty besides for dash panels and rings, there are spinner enemies and rainbow rings placed, which is a really odd decision. Besides that, the layout is mostly missing some specific camera angles and a dash panel or two, making the last 2D section specifically quite hard to get through. This layout actually has remnants of an even earlier version of this stage, which is actually still left over in this build. Yeah, you heard that right. Before the game's release and sometime after the game's announcement, there was a leaked trailer for the game which featured a version of the game still in beta, looking noticeably early and incomplete, which I'll also take a deeper look at further in the video. One of the most interesting finds here is a completely different version of Savannah Citadel, one that can never be seen in the final game at all. Well, it turns out that the level geometry and collision data for this stage is, as I've mentioned, still left over in the preview builds. Some areas of the level are mostly the same, namely the first 2D section, but after that the level is basically completely different. I don't even know how to explain this because they're literally completely different from the final. The first section of the level is different, the second 3D area is completely different, being much wider and really weird, featuring a very different wall running section, with the 2D segment after that also being really different. The tree climb segment is really simple and doesn't loop around like the final one does. Yeah, it's just a completely different stage. Back to the normal preview build, Act 2 is devoid of any objects besides a gold ring. Even so, this stage features an unused layout that's very similar to the one I've shown in the previous video, featuring obstacles like spike balls and flame pillars, although in different arrangements. Act 4 features a very early layout that can't be completed without utilizing the debug mode, having the gold ring in the middle of the fucking stage, as well as some pretty buggy and textured platforms. Act 1 Night is basically just an early layout with nothing very interesting, although some collision appears to be missing, making you face through a few selectable walls. There is also an even early layout for this stage that goes completely unused, having a few untextured objects and an early gold ring positioning. Act 4 Night is just a really fucking weird stage. Its name implies it was split from Act 1, and before its starting segment is a very early layout that looks more like a test set than anything, having untextured items and many random buttons. If you place this layout into Act 1, this section loosely lines up with the terrain. The layout of this stage is pretty unfinished, containing untextured poles and even some diagonal ones that are never seen in the final. And lastly, for this fucking level, Act 2 Night also features a very early layout missing a lot of objects in its second half. This section also has a weird little diamond object in the place of the platforms, which is quite strange. As for Cool Edge, the hub world is literally final except for the lighting, which seems to have a warmer tone. Act 1's layout is pretty similar to the final one, although a few differences include a collapsing glacier on the water running section, an early gold ring, and the camera frequently bugging out in the final bobsled section. Act 2 and 3 just crash the game. Act 4 ends halfway through and doesn't go backwards like the final one. Act 1 Night has no enemies, and Act 2 Night is completely missing objects besides a gold ring right at the start. As for Rooftop Run, the hub world is basically identical to the final. Act 1 is pretty much final. Act 2's camera is basically non-functional and only has the object layout for a single lap, also missing a gold ring and having mostly untextured platforms. Act 3 is also a very early layout using mostly untextured platforms, and the chow that are supposed to be here are replaced with the clear collection object I've shown you in the previous video. Act 4 once again also features a very early layout that's pretty much functional, although is missing the aero chasers or auto running. Act 5 is very incomplete, as it basically only has egg spinners and only up until halfway. Act 1 night is also very incomplete, having a gold ring right at the start and with the terrain being kinda fucked up in some way. It also spawns you inside some walls and is completely devoid of objects besides a ring or two. Also different in this stage is the presence of an elevator in the clock tower, which although does go unused in this stage in the final, it is used in the Spagonia hub world. It was meant to carry the player up if they accidentally fell, making this section of the stage easier. This unused gear object was most likely meant to be used here as well. And Act 2 night crashes if you move forwards whatsoever, thus its object layout apart from the starting segment is unknown. As for Dragon Road, the hub world is also identical to the final except for the water effects, which are clearly bugged. There are also some sort of floating lanterns, which are missing from the final. Act 1 is mostly final, Act 2 is also mostly final, although it's possible to get launched off of the 2D path. Act 3 just crashes the game, as its folder is completely absent from the game files. Even though loading Act 4 normally just crashes the game, its layout can be restored and loaded into the final game. The most glaring differences are a different, much easier and shorter object layout, as well as a drag and run segment at the end, which is completely absent in the final. Act 1 night contains a build date in its name weirdly, being the 9th of June of 2008. The beginning of the level has very few objects and some enemies. About halfway through the level you can actually spawn a gold ring with a lever, which is a bit weird. What would become known as the beta section of this stage, which was later reused for a DLC level, seems to be the most complete segment in this build. Act 2 night features a very early layout, having untextured platforms, no enemies and a gold ring right at the start. And Act 3 has no layout, just level geometry and collision data. As for Tornado Defense Act 1, the normal difficulty is basically a much faster and almost impossible to complete version of the stage, spawning a large number of enemies. The hard variant has nothing besides the final boss, which has incomplete subtitles and can be instantly beaten by pressing both triggers. And the very hard variant appears to be an easier version of the normal difficulty, as even though a lot of enemies appear, they are not as fast. If you're wondering, loading Act 2, Shamar, Empire City or Adabat just crashes the game, as they are missing in this disc. Now let's actually take a look at the debug menu. The install debug menu can be accessed by moving the cursor to the left on the title screen and selecting the install option. Unfortunately, a lot of what this menu was used for seems to have been dummied out of this build, likely as a space-saving measure, as this build was sent to the press as a review copy. Firstly, the ROM folder is basically just a stage select, allowing you to select any act of a stage providing it's present in the game files. Town is basically the same thing except for hub worlds. Interestingly, some of these stages use alternate internal names compared to the stage select. Boss is also the same principle except for bosses, although you can only select 5 of these, as all the other ones are missing. Some of the bosses' names are also different compared to the final version, with Egg Devil Ray being named Egg Ray Fish and the Dark Guardian being Dark Gaia Keeper. Sonic Test is a list of test areas for Sonic. Unfortunately, all of these crash the game. It's up to speculation whether the files are on the second disc or if they were simply left out of this build. Same goes for Evil Test, which are the test levels for the Werehog. Somewhat related to the previous two, Level Design Test seems to be something of a scratchpad for level designers, allowing them to quickly jump to specific areas of the stages, which either include descriptions of the area or what needs to be fixed in them, like adding specific camera angles for example. Same goes for Stage Sonic and Stage Evil. Besides featuring entries for what's supposed to be the final stage, there are also folders with an old underscore prefix, suggesting they are part of the old versions of these stages seen in the leaked trailer, although all the options crash the game. NPC Test also crashes the game, though the options here appear to just be tests for their pathfinding, aka how they walk through the hub worlds, as well as tests for the Air Chaser AI. Unit Test appears to be some sort of particle test, although it doesn't load. Design Check, I really have no idea what it could be. All options crash the game and it only has Sonic's and the Werehog's name written multiple times. Tool contains multiple entries for tools used for the game, such as Sparkle, which is the particle editor, and Inspire, which was the tool used for the cutscenes. Other is a list of miscellaneous screens and functions, and most of this stuff either crashes the game or basically does nothing. All of Sonic Object Test's entries crash the game. Everything in the event subfolder loads, however the camera is stuck at 000. Going by the name of the folder and the files in it, it was probably a way to watch these cutscenes, although it's clearly non-functional. The movie options are meant to load specific trailers or teasers that are missing from the game files. Save test and install test just seem to boot you back to the debug menu. Disk swap prompts the Zine emulator to insert a third disk. This suggests there's even a third disk waiting to be discovered rather than just two. And achievement also seems to just boot you back to the debug menu. Sound test, system test and PS3 test crash the game. Title loads you back to the Sega screen. World map loads that early world map tutorial I've already shown you. Ending loads an early version of the credits using a clearly incorrect font map. A promotional image left unused in the final game is shown in the place of the postcard photos of Sonic and Chip. And sequence entry point just crashes the game. This build also has an actual debug menu accessible during gameplay, allowing you to mess with multiple aspects related to the stages. Most of the entries are in Japanese, but there is a mod that translates most of it by next in HKRY, so make sure to check it out. Firstly, in every stage there's a coordinate display which gets drawn in this text box. You can completely fill up your boost meter by pressing both shoulder buttons. By pressing the shoulder and B buttons, you can activate a developer menu featuring some information about the game. Config lets you activate pad input, whatever that means or does, as well as changing the transparency of the windows. Counter displays the FPS as well as the total loaded polygons, vertexes and materials, although this last display seems to be non-functional. And Profiler appears to also be non-functional, but would probably show how much system resources certain tasks within the game were consuming. There's also the word HOJ written at the bottom, which might be familiar to some people who watched my Sonic Heroes Cut content video. You can enter a sequence check menu which doesn't really work at all, as most options you select will just crash, thus what it's supposed to display not really getting displayed. Now the actual debug menu. By pressing the right shoulder button 10 times and pressing the right stick, you can open the debug operation tool. The first thing you can do here is position Sonic however you like, wherever you like. You can also see text displays of invisible objects mostly related to camera behavior. The text at the top roughly translates to moving mode, moving speed, which allows you to change the speed of the camera modes. The repeated text at the right appears to be inside the keyboard shortcuts folder, with the repeating text translating to this item is only for PC, which makes sense. The string at the top of the actual menu translates to tool launcher and can't be pressed as it's a mere indicator. The first selectable option is the set editor, in other words an object layout editor. You can basically place any object of your liking as long as it's present in the list, and you can also see some test objects that I've shown you in the previous video, which in the final game were completely invisible, yet here can actually be seen. They are not very interesting, they feature pretty basic textures and really only have a very basic functionality, but at least it's easier to visualize. The second option is apparently the newest version of the parameter editor. This editor features a lot of stuff to edit, most of which are in Japanese, so it's really hard for me to cover all of this, as I have to use image translation to even understand what this is supposed to be. You can literally change values related to basically anything you can think of in the game, from Sonic's and the Wirehog Zone attack physics and behavior to manually ticking which stages you have completed or not and everything in between, so go wild. The third option is apparently an older version of the set editor, which doesn't really do anything. All you can really do is press the X button, which will turn the screen darker, which is a bit weird. The fourth option is also an older version of the parameter editor, which doesn't really work. The fifth option is a spline mode, which basically tells you if you're in a 3D or 2D segment. The sixth option is follow player. Disabling this detaches Sonic from the camera movement, allowing you to move freely without carrying him around. In this state, a new option appears named call player, which teleports Sonic to the camera position. Move to warp point apparently does nothing. The ninth option refers to an instance brush, which is related to real-time editing of foliage, yet it doesn't really work and just acts as a free camera. The 10th does nothing, but probably has something to do with remote controllers. The 11th is the actual free camera option. The 12th refers to the motion camera, which is most likely the camera used for the scrapped replay feature I covered in the previous video. It doesn't really do anything here, but it does function, more or less, in one of the prototypes I'll be covering next. Inspire Preview starts the oldest version of the Inspire cutscene viewer, doing nothing apparently. Inspire Preview Second is the newest version of this viewer, allowing you to load real-time cutscenes in whatever stage you're at, as well as loading multiple cutscenes at the same time, allowing for some interesting outcomes. Seriously, you can really glitch the game with this. And the last option has to do with player options. You can change multiple things here, like getting all items or changing the number of lives and rings you have. Selecting the Return to World Map option boots you into the DOTS operating system, loading a complete version of the world map with some oddities I've already shown you previously. There is also an option to kill yourself, with an incredible name. So yeah, that's about it for the preview build. Now let's take a look at the October 14th, 2008 prototype. This build, being mostly a debug build, was actually the one used to make the Prima strategy guide for the game, having been built 2 weeks before the final and released by the Hidden Palace website on the 25th of December 2022 as part of their Project Deluge lot. Most of the game at surface level is practically identical to the final, though there are still some noticeable differences. Firstly, the game still runs at an uncapped frame rate, drifting still doesn't work, the picture used for Windmill Isle Act 2 is different, the coordinates display is still visible, and Sonic's voice clip is triggered every time he stomps, much like the preview build. There are also some slight differences in level design. Dragon Road Night Act 1 has a completely different layout for the ending segment, which looks quite similar to the one that was later reused for the DLC level. This means that you can access the beta section of this stage in the normal main act, which isn't possible in the final without DLCs. Even then, this section is quite different compared to it. Same goes for Arid Sands Night Act 1. The beta section I've shown you in the previous video, which you can really only access by utilizing glitches, also being devoid of any objects, although still being normally inaccessible here, has actual objects that make this area normally traversable. The first half of this segment was reused for the DLC stage, however the part after this cliff goes completely unused in the final and actually leads to the Gaia temple, as I've mentioned in that video. Skyscraper Scamper Day Act 1 has some dash panels to aid you in the drifting sections, and Eggman Land has a few more stage hazards, like fire torches, suggesting the stage was originally meant to be even harder. Now let's get into the actual interesting part about this build, the debug menu. Well, more or less interesting, as a lot of it is identical to the preview builds, yet there are some options which do work differently, so I'm really only going to cover those. The menu is also in Japanese, but there is a mod that translates it to English by Glitch God Zero, so make sure to check it out. The motion camera actually works here, as it teleports you to a set spawn and has cinematic rotation controls. Inspire Preview has similar options to motion camera, although does nothing, and selecting the last option crashes the game. Inspire Preview Second works identically to the preview build, even though it's apparently non-glitchable, as the game appears to crash if you load multiple cutscenes at the same time. For Debug has a bunch more working options this time around. You can still change the number of shop rings you have or get all items, but you can also boot into the Install Debug menu, which is normally not accessible here, allowing you to enter some stages that you couldn't in the preview build, like Tornado Defense Act 2, which for the normal difficulty just loads the normal stage, but for the hard and very hard variants it doesn't even load enemies, just a tornado's path. There are also options to give you more lives, to be invisible to enemies, as well as multiple story flags. And Medal Checker lets you turn on or off flags which dictate if you collected a specific medal or not. And that's about it for this build. The only other leftover build is the October 28, 2008 prototype, although it was built just one day before the final and thus has no differences basically. So let's take a look at some trailers. The trailers we'll be diving into are the early beta leaked trailer and the E3 trailer. So starting by the leaked trailer, the graphics are far more basic than the final game, as the lighting is more generic and less bright, most noticeable on Sonic and the Rainbow Rings. Most of the special effects, particularly the grinding sparks and the ones for collecting rings, are missing. Sonic's boosting effect is also quite different, with air rushing past him instead of the final's blue aura. Geometry is very basic, lacking various details and having rather noticeable pop-in at various points. You can also see the early Savannah Citadel I mentioned earlier, as well as an old windmill isle, probably the same referenced in the Install Debug menu. This trailer shows Sonic Unleashed in a very early state, somewhat resemblant of the SD version, suggesting these were most likely meant to be identical instead of two completely different games. As for the E3 trailer, the most noticeable difference is the frame rate, which is running consistently at 60 FPS. While the final PS3 version does allow for this, it's very unstable and prone to dipping, thus it barely reaches 60 FPS anyways. The footage was most likely recorded on a development kit, which were considerably more powerful than the retail hardware. The draw distance seems to be bigger in this build, as you can see a lot of distant buildings in the background which can render from so far out in the final. All object layouts are different compared to the final, but they are generally emptier. The lighting has had a big improvement compared to the leaked trailer, even though it's clearly still not finalized, as some areas look noticeably darker compared to the final. And the egg fighters T-pose for a few frames whenever they are hit by Sonic, which wasn't the case in the leaked footage. Now let's take a look at some promotional material. More or less at the same time the leaked trailer was well, leaked. A few screenshots for the game were also leaked by the Sonic Emerald blog. These feature one of the stranger mysteries of this game which wasn't solved until 2022, which was the origin of the infamous image where Sonic makes a contorted face of horror while being shocked. Believed to be an early version of the same shot from the opening, it was revealed that that was actually the case, being packed among other screenshots which show this intro cutscene in a somewhat finished although clearly unpolished state, with the lighting still not being refined and some effects and animations being either missing or different, with such examples including the Sonic face. Also, in Marta's website, which was the studio in charge of making the pre-rendered cutscenes, the opening of the game was available to watch. Weirdly, even though the animation is literally identical to the final one, there is a single frame where you can see Sonic's fucking skeleton, also in the same scene where he gets shocked. It seems this scene had a lot of problems during development for some reason. Additionally, there is a very early screenshot of the first in-game cutscene of Windmill Isle which is completely untextured and has Sonic using his 06 model. This supposedly pertains to a really early prototype for the game which was apparently sent to Hidden Palace. Note this was posted more than 2 years ago and we haven't heard anything from it since, so I won't be able to talk more about it in this video. If something more comes out about it in the future, I'll make sure to make a video on it. As for promotional screenshots, there are a ton of them, with basically every single one showing a very early iteration of the game. Firstly, an iteration of Sonic's jump wall which appears to be somewhat closer to the final version, even though it's from a build even older than the preview, which is weird. Here is a screenshot of a removed drifting segment from Savannah Citadel. The sky in these screenshots appears to be really bright, completely blowing out the color. Here we can take a better look at Sonic's early model, which is clearly less detailed, being made up of less polygons, featuring pretty early textures for his body as he is a different shade of blue, as well as his eyes looking different and his mouth also being a texture instead of being fully modeled. The global illumination at this time is noticeably different, especially lacking the bounce lighting. The rail section in Windmill Isle appears to have no boats in the water. Here is a screenshot with an even earlier version of the homing attack reticle. And here is the spinner enemy, with its rotating blade effect being either really bugged or very different. Even though this screenshot is much closer to the final, judging by the HUD and Sonic's model, the speedometer text overlay looks quite different. And some screenshots for the Werehog have the debug developer menu icon on the top left of the screen. Other differences I haven't covered include different camera angles, layout differences, or other very minor differences. So that's about it for this. Now let's take a look at some concept art. Concept art for Chip shows him in multiple different forms, with him resembling some kind of weird bird at some point. Well, at multiple points in fact, he was a bird in multiple different forms. He was also a flying snake or whatever this is supposed to be, as well as a Ditto and a Jigglypuff of sorts, and a weird fish-like animal. It's safe to say his final design is probably the best one out of all of these. The Werehog was originally supposed to be even edgier than the final version. Here is a sort of flaming design, a wilder scarier design. Here he is being covered in chains as well as black stripes on his arms, and a weird Yeti-like design. The NPCs in the game have a unique design to it which was never seen before, so basically every character or population has its own unique concept art, but there is nothing very interesting about each one. Although the normal Bad Nix's concept art is pretty much identical to their final design, the Dark Gaia minions have some interesting designs, including for the mini bosses, with fully modeled alternate designs for the Titan and Big Mother, all of which have dead written on top to symbolize they've been scrapped. The Spike enemy from the SD version had a different colored head and a more noticeable smile compared to his final design. The Dark Murray was originally supposed to feature a much scarier design, with bigger horns and teeth and red eyes. There is also just a weird in a creepy kinda way design for it, which I'm glad went unused. Aporos' concepts look pretty similar to the final design, as it is just based on the Greek island of Mykonos, but some differences can be spotted, such as wood painted in yellow, which doesn't appear in the final, as well as a rockier landscape and some green fields with ruins of ancient Greek buildings. I really like these concepts, honestly, they are really pretty. Spagonia looks less colorful in the concepts than it does in the game, much more faithful to its inspiration. There is also a pretty cool concept of the University Plaza, being much bigger and grandiose compared to the one we got in the final game. There's even a night version of it. Rooftop Run features my favorite piece of concept art, which is this one. Why the hell does Sonic look like that? There is is also this banger drawing, which is really beautiful too. Chun-nan was originally supposed to feature a warmer atmosphere with a clear blue sky rather than the overcast one they ended up going with. The hub world area was apparently also planned to be surrounded by big mountains and waterfalls, which although we still got in the game, it was in a much smaller scale. Skyscraper Scamper also features a pretty cool concept art. I don't have anything to add really, I just wanted to show it. There's some alternate concept art commissioned by Sega to Studio Aoki for the settings in Sonic Unleashed, all of which look pretty realistic. Besides the hub world concepts, most of these are really generic, just being desert, snow and jungle. Arabat's concepts are really different compared to what we got for the most part though. There's even a unique temple setting which was never really explored in the stage. Well, it was explored but it looked kinda different. There is also a sort of rice plantation for Chun-nan. And lastly, here is some concept art for Professor Pickle's lab in Shamar, being much bigger and detailed. Since I posted the cut content video, there's been a resurgence of research for it. As such, a few more things have been discovered in the last few weeks, which I'll be going over now. All of these are from the final. Firstly, a bunch of unused animations for the werehog have been found. There is an alternate animation for opening a door which can never be seen. Note that in the final game, the werehog does open doors by lifting them, but he can never separate them like in this animation. Here are a bunch of animations for unknown scrapped gimmicks. All of them refer to a pillar object. Here is a scrapped animation for failing the aerial pile driver combo. And here are a couple called give and item, which were probably alternate animations for the put and pickup animations. As for unused objects, a door, a handle, a swing pole and a pillar, all using alternate textures, are unused in Windmill Isle Night. A CD and a cassette were meant for missions in Empire City. A water variant of the ice spikes is left over and completely unused for Cool Edge. The only difference it has is that it can really only be placed in water and will rise to the surface. Interestingly, and I'm really mad this wasn't discovered before I posted the video, early names for the stages and bosses in the game were found. Half of them are identical to the final, but the other half features some pretty interesting names. Windmill Isle was called White Island, Rooftop Run was Orange Roofs, which is used in the Japanese version. Savannah Citadel was Cray Castle, most likely misspelled and intended to be Clay Castle. And Arid Sands was called Hot Deserts, also probably misspelled and was meant to be Hot Desert. As for bosses, all names are completely different from the actual used ones, to the point I don't even know which is supposed to be which. All you can assume is that the names are organized from first to last in the game order, but besides that they have nothing in common with the final names. There are also a bunch of inventory items that are listed but can never be obtained. All of them use placeholder images except for the flowers and gift items. And yeah, that's about it for this part. The video containing the analysis of the game's development and some other interesting trivia will be coming out in a few weeks, which is basically a sequel to this video. I recommend watching the cut content video in the meantime as well if you haven't already. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications, as it does really help me out a ton. You can also support me on Patreon for €1.50 and get some perks, like early access to videos, your name at the end of the screen, and other stuff soon to be added there. I also have a Twitter if you want to follow me there, and check out my community tab once in a while where I post quite frequently with video news. And that's about it really. Stay tuned for part 3 and I'll hopefully see you soon.